Hello, viewers. Let us discuss today the topic globalization and social movements. Globalization is a highly popular concept, not only in the discourse of political economy, economics, international relations, anthropology, and so on and so forth, but also in understanding local and social movements. In this lecture, we would basically try to understand whether the social movements happening at the local level, at the regional level, have been impacted by globalized forces or not. We shall try to understand the impact of global forces on local social movements. In this lecture, we will also try to understand whether the various social movements occurring in different parts of the world have any connection between them or not. For instance, is there a connect between the women's movements happening in the West and in South Asian countries? Is there any relationship between the human rights movements happening in different parts of the world? Movements taking place in a particular region of the world, how are they connected through different civil society networks spread across the world? The topic is very interesting because it seeks to connect globalization with very local micro movements. In order to facilitate better understanding of this interrelationship between globalization and social movements, I have divided the entire discussion into 4 broad areas. We will start off with the concept of globalization. Then we'll try to understand what is social movement and how are social movements different from global social movements. Then we'll try to provide a theoretical understanding of social movements, and finally, the role of the state, civil society associations, and networks in the proliferation of global movements. Let us start off with a basic understanding of what globalization is. Globalization, as it is popularly understood, is a set of social, economic, political, and cultural processes that have taken place together and produced certain conditions which are characteristic of contemporary existence. Globalization, which is considered to be the most contested concept of the 21st century, has emerged as a significant term in the wide range of popular as well as academic discussions, especially after the Cold War era. The process of globalization integrates national economies into the international economy through trade, foreign direct investment, capital flows, migration, and through the spread of information and communication network. While the Western governments in particular have considered globalization as an external beneficent force, the economic globalization impact on developing countries are particularly severe. It is this negative impact of economic globalization on developing countries which has given rise to different form of protest movements in developing countries, ranging from farmers movements to labor movements to environmental movements and feminist movements. The increasingly global flows and networks also pose threats to cultural identity as well as local environment. The challenges and inabilities to diffuse technological progress made the developing countries create a very strange world that nourishes the feeling of exploitation. It is from this feeling that a sense of frustration and deprivation emerge, leading to the rise of social movements and protests around the world. As a whole, we can see that globalization on the one hand has created vast riches. On the other hand, it has also accentuated inequalities around the globe. This accentuation of inequalities have produced various forms of protest movements which have culminated into serious networked movements. What are social movements? How are they different from revolutions and national movements? Students, we have been familiar with the Indian national movement, the anti-colonial movement, but we also find simultaneously a rich academic literature emerging around environmental movements, human rights movements, civil society movements, peace movements, and the like. So how are social movements different from anti-colonial movement or anti-apartheid movement? Now, social movements serve as voices of protest, of grievances and concerns of individuals and groups, and demand a kind of an alleviation of the social problem that they were facing from multitudinal forces. Social movements may be targeted against the state, against the elite, against the global economic forces, and even against multinational corporations. Unlike the traditional movements, social movements of contemporary times form the most important inter-network movements as an alternate to resist the growing influence of globalization in different parts of the world. This particular lecture examines a broad framework for understanding social movement in the context of challenges posed by globalization. The process of globalization and its consequences has profoundly affected social movements. A social movement starts when there is a feeling of dissatisfaction among a broad section of the population over a common issue. So we need to understand two things. Number one, in our social movements, there is a group behavior and there is a sense of common deprivation and a we feeling towards a policy or a proposal or an economic agenda favored by a government or a global force. Now, we need to understand that social movements are highly complex because they vary from one segment of the society to another segment. Most importantly, social movements are also popularized by civil society activism. In this age of social media and networking, social movements have assumed even greater significance because not necessarily all global social movements occur as protest on the streets or take the form of demonstrations. Many social movements occurring around the world happen on the social media and they target the government of a particular country or governments around the world. So the focus is not necessarily one state government or a national government. It can be the international forum as a totality. Now, social movements, as I just said, is a form of collective action, a collective behavior in which the motivation to act emerges out of the attitude and aspirations of the participants for a better, balanced life. So, it is a sense of deprivation which culminates in a social movement or a social protest. The level of commitment and political activism forms the essential feature of participants who take a vehement part in the organization of social movements. The basic concepts of social movements revolves around a broad camp of multiple kinds of movements, none of which dominate the other. We need to understand one thing, that different social movements occur around different issues. But we also need to understand that these different social movements are not contradictory to each other and they also do not dominate each other. Rather, they complement each other, and that is the reason why we find a culmination of environmental movements and feminist movements in ecofeminism. We also find a culmination of black movement and human rights movement in terms of civil society movements. Therefore, it is very difficult to compartmentalize social movements with just one issue. So they complement a broad range of issues occurring at a particular point of time. Now, social movements are considered to be very strong instruments for resolving socio-economic problems occurring in a particular region. It can be as a response to claims for social justice, cultural rights, environmental consciousness, and so on and so forth. Social movements are themselves shaped by the relationship between the state and the society, because most of the time social movements are directed towards the national government or the state. However, one peculiarity of social movements after 1990s is that post-Cold War era, social movements are no longer directed towards one national government, rather they may be directed towards multiple national governments or towards regional forums, in the sense that they also have assumed a global neoliberal form. Now let us try to understand, if we are speaking of networking and global social movements, automatically the question arises that social movements have been influenced and are influencing the globalization process. The new social movements of the contemporary period involve a network of movements and civil society activism that developed from the earlier ones, but they are more organized, more mature than the social movements of the 70s and 80s. The acceleration of global integration due to the processes of globalization has declined the role of the modern state, which we have already studied. Now, because of the decline and reconceptualization of the modern state, regional social movements have been accentuated at a global forum. The stress is on the importance of civil society to offer a voice towards distressed groups, displaced groups, as well as groups suffering from different forms of deprivation. Because today, the exploitation or frustration does not necessarily always come from the state. It can also happen from global multinational forces. Let us now move on to theoretical perspectives on social movements. Generally, social movements can be theorized from 4 different perspectives. The 4 theories are collective behavior theory, resource mobilization theory, political process theory, and the new social movement theory. Let us briefly understand each of these theories. The collective behavior perspective is identified as an activity concerned with collective behavior of people as a social process leading to multiple processes invoking collective consciousness, in the sense that group of people and organization control the behavior of people and thus emerge as a systematic organized movement around one particular issue. The resource mobilization theory is based on the assumption that humans are rational and view social movements as rational social institutions and social actors taking political action. It also seeks to analyze how globalized forces are taking control over local regional resources, and hence they believe that the collective people have the necessary resources at hand in terms of organizing protest and demonstration to have their voices heard in the national and global arena. The third theory revolves around the political process itself. This approach has focused attention on social movements as new protagonists in the aggression and representation of different interests. Gone are the days when trade unions would just represent the labor interests. Today, a number of movements are being organized in order to provide a voice to the various problems faced by the working class in the contemporary globalized world, where labor migration is quite popular. New social movements, unlike the old social movements, are produced by new contradictions in society, new contradictions between the social forces and the political forces. New social movement theorists argue that instead of labor movements engaged In class conflict of earlier times, the new labor movements of the present day are engaged more with social and political conflicts. So if we can see that the name of the movements may be the same. Environmental movements, the name remains the same in the 70s, 80s, 90s and even today. But we need to understand that the issues taken up by the environmental movements or by the labor movements are grossly different from the issues that they had taken up in the 70s and 80s. The evolution of social movements can be traced to the early 19th century. We need to understand if social movements are so old, what is new about the global social movements? The first thing that we need to understand about global social movements is that they are highly organized and are not confined to a national boundary. Number two, every social movement has a time cycle of its own. No social movement can continue for an indefinite period of a time. In fact, new social movements are represented by an inverse U curve wherein social movements grow, reach a point of peak and then culminate and decline and wither away. This is the very nature of social movements. Thirdly, earlier we found that social movement leadership was provided by a few group of intellectuals who would protest, who would speak, who would provide a platform for the marginalized class. Today we find a large section of the middle class emerging as activists in this global social movement network. We also find that in these new social movements or global social movements, the participants are not necessarily the people who have been deprived by the state or the international governments. Rather, the participants range from those affected to those who are not at all concerned or in any way connected with this movement. Thus, we find that new social movements have become broader both in their systematic organization as well as in their perspectives. Now, social movements are not an unending phenomenon. As I just said, there's a qualitative difference between the new people struggle and the traditional movements. Traditional movements may continue till the cause was served. Many a times today, new social movements may drop out after a particular point of time because the movement itself fizzles away with the spread of time. Let us now try to move about with the next important area of discussion. Is there any link, any direct link between globalization, integration of economies and social networking? Is there any relationship between the modern world emerging as a potent force before the politico-social environment? Now let us try to understand these issues a little deeply. The process of globalization reflects the idea that the modern world is rapidly being moduled and molded into a shared social space because of economic and technological advancements. And the developments of one region have a profound consequences not only in another region but also in a global and remote part of the world, which means that one social movement may have a spillover effect on other national economies and political systems also. The detrimental nature of globalization influences the development process of developing society and widens the gap between rich and poor. This is considered to be the most potent force leading to the rise of social movements around the world. With the deepening of inequalities and rising poverties around the world, we can see that globalization has also accelerated world social protest movements. Globalization also implies that the local and the national as subordinate to the global. Now, because they are considered as subordinate to the global forces, there is a deepening and broadening of political processes. What also happens is that today the local, national and the global forces interact more often than earlier times. And because of this increased interaction between the local and global forces, there is bound to be clashes and contradictions between the local and the global. And this contradiction between the local and the global gives rise to various forms of protest movements around the globe. Now, the process of globalization that has been happening in the last 30 years reflects a situation where the factors of production have become increasingly mobile. Capital moves freely and technology and information diffuse almost instantly across national boundaries. Raw materials are rapidly transported from their source to processing and production sites which are too far away. States, especially developing countries of the world, with varying degrees of intensity, are participating, or rather they are compelled to participate in this process of integration of national economies into a global world economy. On the contrary, the integrating part of the globalization process results in large-scale displacement and social exclusion. There is also a popular apprehension that large groups of people are being left out while global civil society and liberalization engulf the world. So there is more social exclusion, more marginalization than before. Thus, we can see that the anti-globalization struggles which have erupted in different parts of the world with the uncompromising message of opposition to globalization under the broad camps of social movements gain considerable significance in the context. In this connection, we can refer to the various anti-SEZ movements which had happened during the late 1990s and early 2000 in different states of India. Special economic zones are a product of foreign direct investment, which displaced local labor, which displaced local producers, giving rise to a serious form of protest movement against foreign capital and investment. Now, this anti-SEZ movement can be truly said to be social movements against global forces occurring in India. Globalization in modern times is also associated with new patterns of global stratification occurring among states, societies and communities which are increasingly becoming enmeshed in the global order. So no society can remain unaffected and immune from the global forces. In fact, this enmeshing of societies and cultures, which we often call as cultural imperialism or neo-imperialism, has also led to the rise of the popularity of various forms of social protest around the world. Globalization, which we already know has challenged the sovereignty of nation states, poses a threat to state power and territoriality. The threat associated with the idea of a global culture eventually results in a homogenized world culture, which in turn erases differences between ethnic communities, leading to the rise of an impoverished westernized culture. In fact, this domination of the Western culture on micro-ethnic groups is also giving rise to new forms of ethnic movements around the globe. Now let us try to understand, when civil society activism is so popular, is there any connect between national civil society groups and global civil society groups and global social movements? Now we cannot forget the fact that there is a growing interconnectedness of people, communities, networks across the world. And so is true for the civil society networks that are operating at the national level, but they have a global connect. In the globalization discourse, the central role of nation states has become de-emphasized because of the emergence of global governance and the popularity of civil society. The civil society has evolved rather as a conglomerate of individual households and as an inarticulate container of economic classes. In fact, we need to understand that civil society today comprises of various formal organizations who pursue one set of cause or multifarious causes in order to provide a forum of protest for marginalized segments. We also need to understand that civil society groups are also pro-activist in the sense that they also raise issues which may be connected in remote corners of the world. Social movements of the contemporary times thus assume a sense of different direction, different networking with more social groups and civil society organizations as a part of it. Now, why is the civil society groups so very powerful? The socio-economic factors and the technological integration of countries in the world politics is also characterized by a large-scale people's participation in the entire process. There is a growing shift from the national to a more global orientation of social movements, resulting in a shift in the nature of societal conglomeration and homogenization of cultures. The anti-globalization protests, critical of globalization of capitalism, are the result of this interconnectedness. So, social movements are not disparate, local, individualized movements. Rather, they represent an enmeshed interconnectedness of various protest movements. Well-organized public pressure forced the international community to realize the negative impact of globalization. Let us now try to understand the importance of networking in global social movements. Now, it has been found out that aim of this protest is to put pressure upon the new global forces in order to withdraw themselves from this process of continuous creation of inequalities among regions. If we look into the modern times, the problems associated with globalization are faced by the common man. The problems may be different, but they equitably affect the farmer, the worker, the laborer, the common man, the student, as well as all different peoples and associations affected in various corners of the world. So it is imperative to understand that global social movements are also attempted towards creating an anti-systemic movement. They are directed not towards one national movement, but towards the global system as a whole. And this has created what is called a new stage of modernity. Such resistances usually grew from earlier local, national and transnational forces, trade liberalization agreements, and all these agreements somewhere failed to protect human rights, leading to the rise of new global forces. Now, networked social movements. Networked social movements emerged in recent times with the help of the internet and the social media, leading to social changes, raising hopes of a more critical public sphere which try to resist vulnerable influences. Now, globalization, we can say, has become a catchword. Globalization has created an interconnected world. We have already studied that globalization through the creation of networks, civil society activism has created a global force which can resist transnational governance as well as try to provide a voice to the marginalized. But we also need to understand that the growing inequalities and discrimination associated with globalization has challenged the international political economy. Countries, especially developing countries of the world, are subjected to the impact of colonialism and new imperialism. They have also led to higher creation of vulnerabilities among communities. Now, this process of more and more creation of vulnerabilities among marginalized groups have led to more social movements. However, we need to understand that the key concerns of all these social movements, whether carried out at the local level or by the networked movements, more seek to address global ecological or economic problems. Thus, we can safely say that social movements are connected in the sense that they do not try to address only local issues, but try to address global socio-economic issues, trying to ameliorate the conditions of living of people around the world. The inequalities associated with globalization and trade regimes function as safety valves for discontentment associated with globalization. Let us now quickly summarize what we have studied today. Unlike the earlier movements which were not fundamentally organized, global social movements are highly systematic and organized around a single issues or multiple issues. Secondly, global social movements are highly interconnected and are associated with civil society activism. Thirdly, global social movements are increasingly associated with global problems and try to address problems more associated with developing countries of the world. On the whole, global social movements provide a wider framework which help to break down the different barriers and aim towards creation of a world where the greatest good of the greatest number is the sole concern. Thank you.